do that. All right, perfect. So just a few housekeeping items. As a reminder, as I just began it, this webinar is going to be recorded and will be shared to the prenatal SIG discussion board within the week. I would love to introduce the speaker for today, Ben Newsom. He's been a genetic counselor with LabCorp for 2 years, seeing patients in the prenatal clinics around the Northern California area. He has a passion for technology, both in the field and outside, and he's always eager to work with people on new projects to increase the efficiency for GCs and provide a better patient experience. Following the lecture, Ben has kindly offered to send out a PDF which walks through how to download the Translocation program. So this will be sent out along with the webinar recording. So again, keep an eye out for that post in the coming week. There will be time for questions at the end of the talk. Please post those in the Q&A section. I'll monitor those and field those for Ben at the end. So with that, I will hand it off to Ben.
Okay, great. So I'm Ben. I'm a genetic counselor. I graduated a few years ago, so I haven't been here for that long, but I do like to work with technology a lot. So today I'll just be going through the Translocation Risk Calculator. This is the one that was designed by Dr. Carolyn Trunka, as well as I believe she had someone else she was working on it with. Prior to them releasing the protocol and the program, Dr. Trunka, you used to have to email her directly and she would send you back the risk assessments. According to the paper, she would go through about 600 of these a year. So it's really nice that now we have access to it ourselves, although it is a little bit techy, so sometimes it can be hard to use. So for today, I just want to go through some general information with the calculator. I'll go through, I download the necessary software for it, which is just Java. I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. I'll show you how to access the calculator and also how to re-access it. The way that it's downloaded, it can look a little weird, but it is easy to reopen. And then we'll go through all the demonstrations that were in the paper that was published with the calculator itself. And that way we can see how it's used. And I'll also go through a little bit of just some of the ways that the calculator operates as well. At the end, we'll probably have a lot of time for questions. And so feel free to write it down or get ready for it. I think you might be able to put them in the chat as well, but I'm not completely sure on that. So just have any questions ready and we can go through all of them at the end. So to get started, the calculator itself, the purpose of it is for when a couple is pregnant or thinking of becoming pregnant, and one member of the couple has a balanced translocation. If both members of the couple have a translocation, that can make it a little bit more complicated, though you can still get some information from the calculator. And then this is exactly what the output of the calculator looks like. This is from just a random set of information, so this isn't like a specific patient. This is just, I wanted to generate random numbers. So it'll give you a risk for miscarriage based on the translocation itself, but also just general risk of miscarriage, as well as age-related risk. The risk to have a child with an unbalanced translocation. So just having a child who has a chromosome disorder, essentially that's specifically related to the parental balance translocation. They give two different estimates. The low estimate is supposed to be sort of an underestimate number. And so it's based on a more strict data set. So like a subdivision of the number of individuals in the original paper. And then they also give a high estimate. So what the Dr. Trunka considers an overestimate of the risk, and that's based on a less stringent like requirements for including the patients in the data set. So the realistic number should fall somewhere between those two numbers. And those numbers are also affected by some of the inputs of the calculator itself, which we'll go into a little bit later. So some precautions for the calculator. First of all, do always just double check the literature, because there are some balanced translocations that do have information about themselves. The calculator does provide a risk assessment based on data of other translocations, but if you're able to find the translocation itself in a paper, you may be able to get more specific or maybe more accurate information. I give an example of a relatively common balanced translocation. And then there are some things that the calculator cannot do. So it can't be used for Robertsonian translocations. You just need to use the old tables for that. Cannot do inversions on a single chromosome. If it's a de novo, translocation in a child, then of course, there's not going to be a huge recurrence risk for that, and the calculator wouldn't be relevant. Sex chromosomes are not able to be input into the calculator, and translocations involving more than 2 chromosomes, which are extraordinarily rare anyway, but that wouldn't be something that can be input into the calculator. So what I wanted to do for the next few steps, I'm going to show you how to download Java. I'll talk a little bit more about what that program is. I'll show you how to download the calculator, which should be real straightforward. And then, of course, getting the data is just talking to the patient or seeing the patient's medical records to see what the translocation is. How did they find out about the translocation? Sometimes you might know the translocation from the records, but not know how the patient got the information. So you can also use the calculator during the session to kind of get risk assessment on the fly. And then, of course, just putting in the data, it's very straightforward. So with that, let's get down to it. First, I'm just going to start off at the paper. So this is the publication that Dr. Trunka and her collaborators published. And it goes into a lot of depth about what the calculator is, how they originally created it. There's a lot of statistic assessment at the end of the paper if you're interested in the kind of how the calculator works or what the data is that they used. In terms of actually using the calculator itself, though, we're going to skip on down to the material section. So this mentions that you do first, of course, need to download Java. So they provide a link for that. I believe this is the link that goes to all of the, yep. So this is exactly the link you want to go to. It'll have different options for downloading Java. There's ones for if you have a Windows computer, for if you have a Mac. There's also Linux as well, if you happen to be using that, although you probably wouldn't be watching this if you're a Linux user. You probably already have quite a bit of depth on technology. So in terms of downloading it, there are a couple different options. For Mac, it's just based on what your current operating system level number is. In terms of Windows, there's the online and offline versions. It doesn't actually affect the usability of the program. It's just affecting the download. So just go with the online version because it'll detect which of these 2 versions you need. If you need 32-bit or 64-bit, which you don't need to worry about. It'll also download a lot faster too. So essentially what Java is, it's just a programming language. It's been around forever. And all that this program is it's just something to read the program itself and to run it. So it's almost like downloading Microsoft Word in order to open a text document. So it's not something that will like open you up to malware or anything like that. It's just a program to be able to read and run programs in Java. So I already have it downloaded on this computer, and you may actually already have it downloaded on yours as well. You can check that in the search bar by just going to programs and go to J, see if Java is there. And so I'm not going to download it at this time, but it's straightforward. It's just how you download any other program. The next step is, of course, to get the calculator itself. So there's a link to that also in the paper. So we go to that, it'll take you to GitHub, which is a common like programming site essentially. Once you're here, they actually recently changed it. So the text document I'm going to send out, the screenshots will actually be out of date despite only being a few months old. So what you do is you click on the name of the document or program. It'll take you to here. And there's 3 different places you can click to download it. The first one is you can click on these 3 buttons and click download. You can also click on the download icon here. You can also click on the word that just says raw. I don't know why there's 2 different buttons. They do the exact same thing. It even says download raw file when you hover over it. So whichever one you choose, just download it and then go over to your downloads folder. It should now be there. It'll say Translocation Risk Assessments version 5.1 and .jar is the type of file that needs to be run through Java. So assuming you've already downloaded Java, already have the program, all you need to do is just double click on it or click on it and click enter, and the program should pop up. So that's pretty much everything for downloading all the program and downloading Java. It's all pretty straightforward. It's mainly just about having those links and knowing where to click in order to be able to get the program. Once it's up and running, then this is what it looks like. So, sorry, I have a bunch of stuff in the way from the recording. So there's a couple of different places to input. We have the 2 different chromosomes that are affected, if it's the P or Q arm, the specific bands that are affected, the sex of who has the translocation, and then also how you found out about the translocation. We can go into a little bit more information about how those are impacted later. The couple of things I wanted to mention now are primarily two things. The first one being that when you input a chromosome, for the band information, you're only doing the first two digits. So you don't do like the decimal and the additional stuff. It's just the first two. If you don't, or if you put in a decimal, it won't register it. And in fact, anytime you put in anything that the calculator doesn't register, it causes the calculator to just disappear. So if I do that, it'll say it's not valid and it'll close. So it's not a big deal. You just reopen it. And then we can start to go through a couple of the different examples that they gave here so we can make sure that it's operating properly. And actually, I'm going to keep it like this so that we can still see all of the parts of it. So there are a few things to go through, but actually all of the practice examples that they gave do give a lot of information about it. So this will help us learn a little bit more about the calculator. So for the first example, it's a 40-year-old female with this translocation. So let's put it in. We have chromosome 1, P36. So even though it's 36.1, we don't put in the 0.1. The second one is chromosome 16, and that's Q21. I said female, and it did also mention that she's 40 years old. That does play a role, but I'll show you how to do that in a second here. Ascertainment was found by, so she has 2 children with normal karyotypes. Her mother was a known carrier, and she had 3 miscarriages. So for that one, then I guess it would just be done through, I don't actually see what they said the ascertainment was. She already knew about it, but she doesn't have any children with problems. Her mother had multiple miscarriages, so we might put that in. In that case, if we calculate the risk, these are the numbers that we get. It actually does go through all these steps. So these are the numbers that we do get, and it lines up with what they said here. So 47.8 for miscarriage risk, 2.8 for the low estimate, 4.21 for the high estimate. And the reason that I chose miscarriages is just because her mother had the same karyotype and also had a history of miscarriages. Because otherwise, if we put in fortuitously, which wouldn't quite be accurate, the risks are actually quite different. So it drops the miscarriage risk from 47 all the way down to 32, and the 2.8, 4.2 becomes 1.1 and 2.3. So because we do have that history, it would be probably a more accurate risk to put it this way. So if you look at the paper, it goes through like how the risk for miscarriage is calculated, the reason why this number isn't accurate because she's over 35. So for anyone under 35, they use 12% as like the population risk for miscarriage, but that risk does increase with age. And so we actually have an Excel document that's attached to the form, the walkthrough that I'll send, the PDF walkthrough. So if you click on this, you can see that there's an age-adjusted attachment form. And this is essentially just an Excel document that was provided to me, actually. It wasn't one that I've created. And essentially what this does is it allows you to, sorry, I'm having that problem with things being in the way again. There we go. It allows you to put in the information that you've gotten from the calculator as well as the patient's age. And it uses a table over here to calculate what the adjusted risk would be for her age. So the initial percentage that we have is 47. We can be specific, 0.18, although I think it might round it. No, it doesn't. And then age, so it'll grab that percentage from the table. So since we put in 40, it grabs 27. So the age-adjusted risk for miscarriage would be 56%. And we can see if this calculator is working properly by going down to this, and it is the same number. So we know that the Excel sheet is working. We can see that we got the right information from the calculator as well. So I'm trying to highlight just the 56. There we go. So we can see that we got the same answers as from the protocol. That's a good sign. Like I said, if you want to go into the statistical side of it and see like why that is, they do go into more depth on it. But we're just going to kind of talk about the usage of it. She also mentions that she would usually round the numbers. Because this is a low estimate, it's considered an underestimation. She would round it up, and because it's a high estimate, she rounds it down. I I don't really round it that much with talking to the patients. I usually do kind of say the exact numbers, but that's up to your discretion. So let's go on to the second one. Second one, we have a 37-year-old male with this translocation. Her partner has, or they've had, wait, yes, they've had a live-born child without any abnormalities. And so I believe this one ends up being found fortuitously, meaning that they didn't have a history of miscarriages, they didn't have a history of a child with an unbalanced translocation. They probably just did the testing as part of something routine, like part of infertility treatment, or maybe they just did the testing for some other reason, maybe like a family history of intellectual disability. So let's put in the information. We've got chromosome 13 on, oops, I clicked on the wrong program. Sorry, 1 second, gotta get back down to it. So we've got chromosome 13, I think it said Q arm on 13.2, again, leaving out the decimal. Then we've got 15 on the Q arm as well, and that's 1, 2. We're gonna say fortuitously and see if they got the same numbers. They didn't. What did they say? They said that program I put, oh, I'm sorry, I have it set to female. So that's that is something to note. For males, the risk is usually lower. So it is important to make sure that you do change that, because otherwise the numbers will be different. So like I had accidentally shown, these numbers, or the number for miscarriage is quite different, and the risk for translocations is different as well. And so it looks like the numbers are still different.
Looks like it says that the child had an unbalanced translocation.
I'm sorry. Thank you. Yes, I read that incorrectly. Oh yeah, so actually I was gonna go through this later, but maybe it'd be good to go through it now. Depending, or so as I mentioned, it does change, the estimate method does change different things. Most notably, if they do have a history of miscarriage, the risk for miscarriage tends to go up significantly. So it went from 44 to 59, which makes sense. And if they have a child with an imbalanced translocation, then the risk for translocation goes up significantly. With unbalanced translocation versus fortuitous, this number actually stays the same, the risk for miscarriage. So just something that I was going to mention later, but worth mentioning now. And so the risks, so we got the same risks as this. And then notably in the example, the mother of the pregnancy is 29, or it sounds like they're not pregnant yet. So she's 29, so we don't need to use this Excel sheet. We still can, but it'll just give you the exact same number. So if we wanted to, we can put in that just so you can see. So for less than 35 and for the initial risk of 44.74, it rounds it to 45. And as you can see, it still stays exactly the same. That's just because of the calculation, the population risk is already 12%. So when you redo the calculation, it ends up just canceling everything out. So that is pretty much everything for this example, actually. I think the main things that they wanted to show were, if you have a male, the numbers can be different. And then also the unbalanced translocation does make these numbers quite high. And so, like I said, no, don't need to do anything with the age. So for the next one, let's go through that as well. So in this case, we have a 32-year-old female with this translocation. It was detected because she had, oh, that's right, because her mother, yeah, sorry. They found it during her mother's pregnancy that she had the translocation. So that would be considered being found fortuitously. It was found just during, while she was in development. And so because of that, we don't need to put too much stuff in. Let's do the chromosome for Q31, ignore the decimal. Whoops. Chromosome 20, Q11, ignore the decimal. We're back to female fortuitously. And so if we do the calculation, oh, sorry, I did the same thing again, didn't I? Let me see. I'm trying to read through them really quickly. I couldn't remember what all these were. And so they found, wait, let me see. Female with a prenatally when her mother was pregnant. Her parents never had chromosome studies. Okay. Oh, interesting. Sorry, I didn't remember that they did this. So they actually ran all three different options for it. It's interesting. I honestly, from my clinical standpoint, I would probably consider that to be fortuitous just because it was found fortuitously. But I guess they're saying because of lack of other information that run all three risks and kind of take them into consideration when deciding like how to explain it to the patient. Because with fortuitous, the risks do tend to be quite a bit lower because there hasn't been any abnormality found. The risks for the abnormalities don't get increased. So these are the different outputs for, actually we can just run all three. So fortuitous, it's the one they put at the bottom. So 37.39. If there had been a history of multiple miscarriages, that does significantly increase the miscarriage risk. And then for unbalanced translocation, of course, significantly increases the risk for translocations, going all the way from 1% up to 19%. So that is a big jump. Considering she has multiple siblings who are all unaffected, again, I take it into your own clinical opinion, but I would probably consider this to be a fortuitous situation. But because we don't have all the information, you can run all the risks. And like I said, you can also do it during the session as well. So if the medical records just say there's a patient, they have this translocation, but you don't know how they know about it, you can just have the calculator up and have all the information in, but be ready to select what the option is. That way, when you're with the patient, you can say, okay, let me just do the calculations and then discuss what the numbers are and kind of where they came from. I think is generally a good approach for them. And so based on that, they end up having very large ranges. But again, I would try to get a little bit more specific with the patient if you can, with the understanding that this is a calculation based on data from different translocations. This isn't data that we're pulling from a paper based on their personal translocation. So there's always a little bit of a caveat there. And so the next one is another one that is an ambiguous one. So let's go through that as well. For this case, it's a 25-year-old female, so we don't need to take into consideration age-related risks. In this case, it's chromosome 7 on arm P. So let's get that in. And it's 1, 1. And the second one is for 10, P, 1, 1 as well. So let's look through it a little bit. I believe this one is technically considered unbalanced translocation, but we can talk about what the specific situation is. So in this case, the patient has 2 normal children, no symptoms, no chromosome abnormalities. And then on one pregnancy, they found that there was an unbalanced translocation for the fetus, but the fetus was terminated. And so the question is, would that pregnancy have continued all the way to term? Because if it would have continued to term, then we would consider that child with unbalanced translocation. Because what this risk really means is the risk of a live-born child with an unbalanced translocation. So it's not like a mid-pregnancy risk. It's a risk for at the end of the pregnancy. But if the pregnancy may have ended on its own, then that could be considered, even though it's not actually multiple miscarriages, it's miscarriages due to a chromosome abnormality, which is really what we're using multiple miscarriages as like a stand-in for. And so in that case, the risks do become quite different. And so it's a sort of a question of how do you discuss it with the patient? In that case, because the ambiguity is harder to kind of parse through, I probably would discuss all of the numbers with the patient, which is a lot of information, but it is something maybe that's good to go through. The other option is you could just say from 1% all the way to 13, but then of course the ranges are quite large and that might not be that helpful. In the end, there is an increased risk for both a child with unbalanced translocation and for miscarriage. And so that might be the best kind of qualitative way to describe it, just that there are these increased risks. And so we do have some numbers that are based on it, but because the ambiguity of your situation, numbers might not be that specific or not necessarily inaccurate, but not as helpful. They kind of talk about all of that in the paragraph as well. Just saying that, again, because ambiguity, it is a little hard to know exactly what the risks are. But that's why we're here, is to talk through everything with the patients and to see if they might have, or, help them where they need it and try to make sure that they get the information that they are after. So the last one is an interesting one, especially because I specifically mentioned in my slides that, when I was talking through the slides, that this calculator is mainly for when there's one member of the couple who has a translocation. So this is an example where both members have a translocation. So let's punch it into the calculator, make sure that it's still working properly, that we're getting all the right numbers. The first one is the female member of the couple. And so her translocation is on 5 on the Q arm. And we got 1, 2. And then we got chromosome 18 also on the Q arm. And we got 2, 1. So in this circumstance, I actually don't remember what the method of ascertainment was. So let's double check that real quick. That's right. So she has a sister who had an unbalanced translocation. So they have different methods of ascertainment. So because there's the family history of a child with unbalanced translocation related to the patient's translocation, we put that in as the ascertainment method. And so these are the risks that we get. Again, of course, the unbalanced translocation risks are quite high. So same numbers as the paper, that's perfect. And then since they're written down, we write down. And then for the male, his translocation is on 9. Oops, I can't see it because of the calculator. There we go. On the Q arm, on 2, 2, and then over to chromosome 11, also on the Q arm, and 2, 3. I believe for his, so for him, there's a family history of multiple miscarriages. That one's interesting because there's almost because in the paper they choose to use multiple miscarriages as the ascertainment method. That one's a little bit fuzzier to me. Like similarly with the female, because her sister has an unbalanced translocation, as long as the unbalanced translocation appears to be related to the patient's balanced translocation, I think it's reasonable to use that. If she had a random unbalanced translocation that affected different chromosomes, then you'd probably use it as fortuitous. Similarly with this one, his mother has a history of multiple miscarriages, and so it makes sense to use it, but it's like a little bit fuzzier to me. But regardless, for him, the risk is, sorry, we need to switch it to male and say that didn't look right to me. There we go. So the risks are quite high for risk of miscarriage. Risk for chromosome or unbalanced translocation is a little bit elevated, but not hugely high compared to the female member of the couple. And so at that point in time, it's hard to know how to use these numbers necessarily. I think they end up going through the statistics on exactly how to get down to the miscarriage risk, because there is essentially, you look at the, well, they go through it pretty thoroughly. So maybe that'd be better to read it if you want to go through the statistics, because you're able to look at the risk for unbalanced translocation for each of them and subtract out the general population risk for each of them, and then do the statistics in order to see what those risks are all added up. So they end up with 43%. So that makes pretty good sense. There's an increased risk for both of them plus the population risk. So I think just like at a general look, it does feel correct, but you can also go through all the numbers with the paper if you'd like to. It's just all the, just the basic statistics, but again, not things that are fun to do by hand. For the chromosome risks, it's more complicated. What they end up doing is actually just calculating the chance to have a live-born child, I believe, without an unbalanced translocation. And so it's also just kind of doing the basic statistics. The calculation ends up being easier, but at least for me, it mentally feels weirder to do the calculation, just because it feels like the risks, I don't know, maybe that's just me though. The risks feel more intangible a little bit. But same thing, you can do all the calculations. The calculation they end up with to have one or more unbalanced translocations is 11%. And so I guess the reason for me that it feels a little weird is because if the child has multiple unbalanced translocations, it seems like that would be like have an increased risk of pregnancy loss. And I know we're kind of counting for that in the statistics, but also kind of not. So in these more complex cases, there are ways to still use the calculator to at least give you like a ballpark, to give you general information. That way you can talk to the patient in a little bit more of a qualitative sense. Even though these are like very quantitative numbers and some patients do really desire that. With the more complex cases, it does become a little weird. Luckily, majority of the time, at least in my clinical experience, you're only going to have, if a patient has a translocation, it's only going to be one member of the couple. Ascertainment method will hopefully be pretty clear, and everything else should kind of fall into place. And then you can discuss the numbers very directly. So those are all of the examples that they give in the paper. If you do plan on using the calculator, I think it might be a good idea to go through them yourself as well, just to make sure when you input the numbers that everything's coming out correctly, and also so that you kind of understand a little bit of the background. I know we all have like the training, of course, in chromosome disorders, but I feel like using the calculator for unbalanced translocations kind of helps you get even a deeper understanding of how they use or how they work. You can also go into more depth in the paper on what factors play a role in the calculator, because it's the chromosomes that are affected, it's the size of the translocations, it's also like the distance to the centromeres, and there's all these details in the paper that are at least interesting to hear. And so with that, I had wanted to, at the end here, kind of go through or show a few things with the calculator that are kind of like different patterns in it. We went through a couple of them while I was going through the examples, mainly because I did a couple of typos during the first couple of examples. But some things that I wanted to show are let's do it all fortuitously. And let's do female, so the number's a little higher. With large chromosomes, the risk of miscarriage tends to be higher, but the risk for unbalanced translocation, or a child with an unbalanced translocation, tends to be lower. So I just use chromosome 1 and 2, some of the biggest. If we do 21 and 22, this number should go down, these numbers should go up. Oh no, but I accidentally used the same. So because I use such small chromosomes, I accidentally used a band that doesn't exist on them, so it broke the calculator and it closed. So let's do that again. Let's do ones that'll for sure exist. Let's just do 1, 1. For both of these, we're going to stick with fortuitous. So high risk miscarriage, low risk for chromosome disorders. And then we're going to switch to 21 and 22. And so this number went down quite a bit. These numbers did go up. The reason for that, of course, makes sense if you think about kind of the background of it. Having the large chromosomes have chromosome abnormalities, a lot more genes are affected, ends up leading to less viability for the pregnancy. Having much smaller chromosomes, fewer genes are affected. So the chance to have a live-born child with a chromosome abnormality increases because it's more viable. So I feel like that makes sense just kind of innately. And then the other thing I wanted to show, which I kind of already mentioned, the risks for males tend to be lower. So everything went down with that. So we went going from male at 38 up to female, it's 41. These numbers are already really low, but they did still go down. So like 0.08 went to, I think, 0.06, 0.39 went down to 0.34. That's again, just based on their data. Of course, also still makes sense with some of the information that we know in terms of sperm and egg development and how chromosome disorders can kind of pop up from that. And then, as I had mentioned, but let's go back through it again. Let's try something that's a little bit bigger. I just want bigger numbers. So let me go to some other things. Okay, bigger-ish. So for fortuitous, everything is kind of at its lowest value. So actually that may also be something to consider clinically as well. If you do originally find the information fortuitously, but then the couple has multiple miscarriages or they have a child with an unbalanced translocation, you can always go back and redo the calculation because it will be quite different. So again, with the multiple miscarriages, this number is going to go up quite a bit. And with chromosome abnormalities, that'll go back down, but these will go up pretty significantly. So even though you originally put in the information when you first give it to the patient, it's not necessarily a static thing, because if we do get more information, it is worth it to go back to the calculator in order to see what their new risks could be. So it's almost like doing a Bayesian, but you can just put it in the calculator and it's not actually Bayesian. Yeah, so sorry, I talked really quickly, which I have a habit of doing. So we have quite a bit of time for more questions or for any questions and things. So let's go over to that.
Okay, yeah, there's a couple questions in the chat that we can review. But first of all, I want to say thank you so much. I think that that was super helpful to walk through those examples. And I particularly like that we have those available so that folks can go back and try themselves and have the answers available to them so they can build confidence in going through the calculator itself. I think I'm feeling like one of the big takeaways is that these calculators really have their limitations as estimates, and are reliant on our own clinical interpretation. I hadn't really thought about that coming into the equation, and I'm so glad that you highlighted that. It seems like, for example, seeing one miscarriage, is that really the same as multiple miscarriages? And presumably that's just a reflection of the limitations of the data that exists right now.
Yeah.
But I really like how we have these calculators in comparison to sending off an email and getting numbers back. Like, it feels a lot more transparent in many ways. And again, is a good way for us to see specifically some of our limitations of availability to precisely calculate, but at the minimum, as you emphasized, allow us to ballpark to help guide our patients. And so it seems like two of the questions in the Q&A box are kind of related to each other, of curious why Robertsonian translocations are not included in the software. But then it seemed like you used an example of 21 and 22, which still popped out some numbers. So do we know if...
Yes, yeah, so I can actually talk on that. So sorry, I clicked the Q&A and now it's in the way. There we go. So you'll notice that when I did 21 and 22, I explicitly chose the Q arm for them. The reason I did that is because Robertsonian translocations are always on the P arm, because that's when the acromere breaks off. Let me bring up a picture of that real quick so I can, in case anyone's forgetting some of the, because I'm sure for a lot of people it's been a long time since they've been in school. Is it acrosome? I thought it was acromere. And okay, that's not right at all. Man, maybe I'm forgetting the name of the thing. I'll just bring up chromosome 21, and then we can talk on that.
Yeah, if you pull up the ideogram, for example.
Yeah. Man, I'm just getting a lot of, oh yeah, ideogram, perfect, thank you. So on the reason Robertsonian translocations happen is because on the chromosome, what is it? It's 14 through 16, 21 through Y. The top of the chromosome, it's so tiny and so fragile. This series of, this part right here, for some reason, almost all of them have the same set of, not the exact same set of genes, but genes that are used to make, man, I'm forgetting some of the specifics of it, but they're used to make the, they're used for something that reads DNA during the whole gene to RNA to protein sequence. So there's a ton of them in our genome. Almost all of them are in the parts of the chromosomes that have this weird little bit here. And so when Robertsonians happen, what's actually happening is that this tiny piece of the chromosome breaks off on both of them. And that's why they stick to each other in that way. So if I pull up just like a Robertsonian translocation, you can see that it's that tiny piece. Yeah, acromere, I was right. So that tiny piece is the thing that's breaking off. So you won't really see a balanced translocation on the P arm of these chromosomes, most likely, except in the case of Robertsonian translocations. This makes Robertsonian translocations behave uniquely because during division, or it's because they essentially become one new chromosome. With most balanced translocations, you have two chromosomes starting off, and you still have two at the end. They just have pieces from each other. With Robertsonian, they really get completely stuck to each other. The P arm for both of those is usually just lost during cell division. And so the resulting chromosome ends up being just singular. That's why the karyotype for people with Robertsonian translocations, it's not 46 anymore, it's usually 45, comma, blah, 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 blah. that's the sort of reasoning for why they behave different. In terms of the calculator, or in terms of risk assessment, the calculator won't work. It'll probably, I can actually try real quick, but I think it'll probably have that error message pop up and just kick you off. So let's try for both of them. We'll try for 1-1. I think that'll exist. Yeah, so it's not going to be, it's not in their tables. It's explicitly not in the data of the calculator. So it'll just cancel the calculator out. In terms of risk assessment, we usually use those tables, if anyone remembers, from like our textbooks and things. I have a copy of the table actually.
Yeah, it seems like what you're saying is that the Robertsonian translocations were not included in that data set, and also that those risk estimates have just been better established and published already. And so
Yeah.
the calculator probably has less utility in that way.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the table. The numbers look right to me. This is the type of table that we usually use for Robertsonian risk because they have been studied specifically for the risk assessment of it. So you have female, male, you have the different common Robertsonians, and usually there's also more information about it, but this table doesn't happen to have that. But yeah, so that's for Robertsonians. And then here I can actually see the questions real quick. So I can read through them. So that one's the one we just answered. Did I miss here? Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah, sorry. And then as I had kind of mentioned for the chromosome 21, 22, because I did the Q arm, it's actually, yeah, so it's funny that I did do 21 and 22 because they usually would form a Robertsonian. In theory, they could form a normal balanced translocation because it's on the Q arm, and it would work, and they would act completely differently from a normal Robertsonian. And so the karyotype like phrasing would be very different for that as well. Do you know if the data set which was used to build the calculator is being added to? And similarly, do we know if the calculator will continue to be updated, and if so, for how long? I'm pretty sure the answer to both those questions is no. So the data goes all the way up until 2012, and then that's as far as it goes. And so I don't believe they're getting more data. I think at the end of the paper, they do talk more about the data. So you have background information. They talk about all of that. They talk about the like technical side of the data, technical side of translocations. And so they do go into a lot more depth on that. My understanding is they aren't adding new information. I don't think they're going to add anything to the data tables or do reassessment on that. In fact, my understanding is that essentially what this calculator is, it's just a computer program running the model that they created based on the data that they had collected. I know that they had an initial paper with a lot of the data, although I don't think that initial paper went up to 2012. So they were still collecting the data at some point. But I don't believe they're updating it anything beyond that. I'm pretty sure that's as far as it's going to go. Maybe at some point in the future, someone will want to add more. Because the calculator comes from GitHub, if someone has the know-how, they can easily just grab the calculator and open it up and add or tweak it or change it if someone in the future ever wanted to update it. If we're 20 years down the line, maybe having more information than from 2012. On the other hand, it is over 6,000 individuals. And so I don't know if the risk assessment would necessarily change that much. So I don't think there's any plans by Dr. Trunka to update it, but maybe someone in the future might.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. It sounds kind of like the model was created based on observations about how these chromosomes work in general. It'd be really interesting to follow up with Dr. Trunka with an email about that. I can send one along and see if we can get further comment and then include that if I get more information in the discussion post where I post our recording and those resources.
Yeah. So my understanding is it's actually 3 different models, one for risk of miscarriage, one for the low estimate, one for the high estimate. That's why the numbers are different for those two. Although I think the main difference of the last 2 models are just essentially the people who are allowed to be included in the data set. And so in terms of how the calculator works, based on the paper, it sounds like they got all that initial data whenever they were kind of publishing that first paper. and they were uh, sorry, I'm kind of blanked on what I was saying there. But yeah, it sounds like when they got the initial data, when they were kind of deciding who would be in the model and not, um, at that point they analyzed every different factor they could kind of think of for what might impact the model or might impact the risk for each of these things. And then they found things that seemed to actually play a significant role. So it was the kind of things I was mentioning, like the size of the chromosome involved, and also like the distance to the centromere. So those are the three that are coming to mind. I don't remember if they said there were anything else, but those are the main ones. But yeah, were there any other questions? Not so far.
I don't think so. I think we can give it just another minute or two to make sure that folks don't have any other questions. But again, I think that this is so helpful. I think that, looking at this program immediately, maybe in part because it does look like it's from the 90s, which no shade, they didn't need to do anything like that. But I think it's,
Yeah.
At first glance, really intimidating looking. I know that I am certainly not a cytogenetics expert by any stretch of the imagination, but it seems like it's a lot more simple to use than I think that I had originally thought, and seeing those walkthroughs live was really, really helpful.
Okay, great. Yeah, and sorry, I forgot there was one other thing I meant to mention at the end, or maybe I did briefly mention it. When you put in the chromosomes, one other thing that is important is actually that you put the largest chromosome first. The reason for that is that the way that the model is set up is it was only programmed to see the largest chromosome first. You can put the smaller chromosome first, but it ends up giving you inaccurate numbers. So right now we have 33,511. Now we have 42,408. It's essentially the way that it was programmed. It ends up not operating properly if you put them in reverse order. So something that's kind of important to mention when we write out the karyotype, we always put the largest one first. So it probably not something you would necessarily do, but just something to maybe kind of keep in mind because it does impact the results.
That's really good to know. I think I will. I'm sure that it says that in the publication, but again, in our follow-up post, I'll try to include that that specification as well, because it's not one that just makes the whole program rage quit you.
Yeah, no, because it's still able to grab the numbers because
Exactly.
these are ones that exist, but the calculations get put in upside down, so it ends up not being correct.
Yeah, really good to know. Thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, and something that I guess I should, but I didn't really specifically state is that anytime the calculator is closed or anytime you should need to use it again, you should have to reopen the same program. It might be good to give it maybe a different name than this. It's very, I don't know, for me, the name kind of like slides off my brain and I don't remember it anymore, but just like translocation risk calculator or something. And put it somewhere that you'll be able to find again. If not, you can always re-download it because it's a very small program, as you can see.
All right. Well, with that, thank you again so much, Ben. And as a reminder, I know I've said it a zillion times, but we're going to go ahead and post this within the next week. We'll follow up on that one question to see if we can get more information from Dr. Trunka. And otherwise, I hope that everyone has a really good rest of their day. And thank you again, Ben.
Yep. Thank you. Bye.